For this lecture, I want to talk about how this decade, the roaring 20s, how it comes to a screeching halt, collapse of the American economy, really the world, global economy, and the Great Depression, sort of what that experience is like, and then into President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's response to the Depression and what we call the New Deal, right? What he called the New Deal. So that's the plan for this lecture. If you are familiar at all, some of you may remember sort of the recession, 2008 recession. Have families who experienced hardship as a result of the 2008 recession, or maybe you've just sort of read or familiar, right, with those stories. But if you have some familiarity with the 2008 recession, you'll know that, or you'll see that there is a lot of similarities. In some ways, it's us not learning from the Great Depression and falling into some of the same problems in 2008 with that economic downturn. So that's the plan for this second lecture of the week. So in October of 1929, President Hoover traveled to Michigan to take part in the golden anniversary of the Festival of Light, celebrating Thomas Edison's invention of the light bulb 50 years earlier. So this big celebration, and the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, goes and he gives this speech, and it's all about sort of the progress that the country has had and all the great things that have happened through the last decade, but innovations even beyond, right? Obviously with the light bulb, technological breakthroughs and how that's continued in the 20s, and everything is great. And then 8 days later, on Black Tuesday, the stock market collapses. So this October 29th, 1929, we have the collapse of the stock market. So you can talk to your econ professors to get more in depth in some of this, but a lot of people would argue, if you're talking about the market, why does it collapse? Economists would say the market was excessively bullish. So if you've heard of bull markets and bear markets, so a bull market is the expectation that stock prices will continue to go up, right? And things will go up. A bear market, or those who are acting as bears in the market, are betting on anticipating it will go down. And so the thought is almost there's too much confidence, too high confidence in business of the 1920s, in these various companies, in the stock market, people investing their life savings in stocks. And it just sort of goes up like this. And you know, it's fine if the expectations and the prices match the actual production and the profits that the companies are making. But when there's a discrepancy and you start to see these industries stagnate, that's when you get this dramatic drop off. And then as panic selling kicks in, it just makes it go that much worse. So it's kind of a like self-fulfilling thing. It's like a vicious cycle in that because people are fearful, because they panic, they sell their positions, right? They sell their stocks because they're worried. But by doing that, they contribute to the economic downturn. As panic selling sets in, you have more than $10 billion in market value that disappears in the span of about 5 hours. So that would be like well over $100 billion today if you were to look at it. And you can just think about the impact that would have if more than $100 billion in the market disappeared in like an afternoon. So soon the United States will find itself dealing with the consequences of this in the Great Depression. Indeed, the whole world will find itself dealing with this. Important to note, though, right, we talk about the stock market crash, but it's not the market by itself. It's not the market by itself. There's frenzied real estate speculation and bust. That should sound familiar to 2008. Irregular business practices. There's land that's undeveloped, mortgages foreclosed upon. This is all familiar to us within the past 20 years of 2020, right? We've experienced some of that with our own economic downturn. The automobile industry starts to stagnate towards the end of the 1920s, which we talked about, obviously, its impact and how important that industry was. Demand for American goods in Europe will decline towards the end of the 20s, in part because Europe has recovered from the First World War, which you watched a documentary on last week, right, the week of Thanksgiving. So that hurts, right? That hurts American businesses when people are not, European countries are not buying as much, right? Not buying as much American goods. So it's like a perfect storm, right? All that together, really simultaneously, just an unfortunate financial storm that hurts the country. Banks will fail. You have runs on banks, which you can sort of see that image there. You can look up, right, bank runs, and you can see photographs of 1929 of people lined up outside banks trying to take their money out because they're worried. So if they have all your money in a bank and these institutions are failing, you want to get your money out. You don't want to lose your money. Again, sort of the cycle of this. If you take your money out, then you are contributing to the thing that you are fearful of. You are actually contributing to the failure of the bank itself. Again, sort of self-fulfilling vicious cycle that we see. I actually want to show you a scene of a bank run from a movie. So this is from It's a Wonderful Life, which is the greatest Christmas movie of all time. There's no debate about this. So, you know, Elf's a fine movie, but it's a Wonderful Life, just so we're clear. So if you have not seen It's a Wonderful Life, you need to watch it this holiday season, right? Very inspiring. It's very long, but very good movie. Anyway, there's a run on the building and loan. So a run, essentially demonstrating a bank run. It's sort of, you get a sense of the fear that builds and some of the back and forth that you'll hear in this scene is indicative of a bank run and how that plays out.
Don't look now, but there's something funny going on over there at the bank, George. I've never really seen one, but that's got all the earmarks of being a run.
Just remember that this thing isn't as black as it appeared.
I have some news for you, folks. I was just talking to old man Potter, and he's guaranteed cash payments to the bank. The bank's going to reopen next week.
But George, I got my money here. Did he guarantee this place?
Well, no, Charlie, I didn't even ask him. We don't need Potter over here.
I'll take mine now.
No, but you're thinking of this place all wrong, as if I had the money back in a safe. The money's not here. Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Maitland's house, and 100 others. You're lending them the money to build, and then they're going to pay it back to you as best they can. Now, what are you going to do, foreclose on them?
I got $242 in here, and $242 isn't going to break anybody.
Okay, Tom. All right. Here you are. You've signed this. You get your money in 60 days.
60 days?
Well, that's what you agreed to when you bought your shares.
Tom, did you get your money?
No.
Well, I did. Old man Potter will pay 50 cents on the dollar for every share you got. Yes, cash.
Well, what do you say?
No, Tom, you have to stick to your original agreement. Now, give us 60 days on this.
Okay, Randall.
Are you going to Potter?
Better to get half than nothing.
Wait. Now listen to me. I beg of you not to do this thing. If Potter gets a hold of this building alone, there'll never be another decent house built in this town. He's already got charge of the bank, he's got the bus line, he's got the department stores, and now he's after us. Why? Well, it's very simple. Because we're cutting in on his business, that's why. Because he wants to keep you living in his slums and paying the kind of rent he decides. Joe, you had one of those Potter houses, didn't you? Well, have you forgotten? Have you forgotten what he charged you for that broken down shack? Here, Ed, you remember last year when things weren't going so well, you couldn't make your payments? Well, you didn't lose your house, did you? You think Potter would have let you keep it? Can't you understand what's happening here? Don't you see what's happening? Potter isn't selling, Potter's buying. And why? Because we're panicky and he's not. That's why. He's picking up some bargains. Now, we can get through this thing all right. We've got to stick together, though. We've got to have faith in each other.
But my husband hasn't worked in over a year, and I need money.
How am I going to live until the bank opens?
I got lots of bills to pay. I need cash.
I can't handle it. Get some faith.
How much do you need?
Hey! I got $2,000. Here's $2,000. This will tie us over to the bank reopens. All right, Tom, how much do you need?
$242.
Oh, Tom, just enough to tide you over to the bank.
I'll take $242.
There you are.
That'll close my account.
Your account's still here. That's a loan. Okay. All right, yeah.
I got $300 here,
All
Joe.
right, now, what will it take to pull the bank open? What do you need?
Well, I suppose $20.
$20. Now you're talking. Thanks, Ed. That's fine. All right, now, Miss Thompson, how much do you want?
But it's your own money,
Yeah,
George.
fine about that. How much do you want?
I get along with money all right. And I'll sign the paper.
You don't have to sign anything. I know you pay when you can. That's okay. All right, Miss Davis.
Could I have $17.50?
Of course you can have it. You got 50 cents. Seven.
We're gonna make it, George.
Six.
I'll never close this up today.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bingo! We made it! No, you think we made it? Look, we're still in business. We've still got $2 left. Well, look, let's have some of that. Let's celebrate it.
So it's really just an excuse for me to show It's a Wonderful Life in a classroom setting and just continue to try to convince people to watch it. So, but you get a sense, right, of the panic and fear that grip people and how that affects these institutions in 1929 and the early 1930s. So, just a couple of things I want to share, right, to give you a sense of the scale of this economic loss. So all Americans are affected by this. Unemployment reaches 25%, some speculate 30%. At the height of the recession of 2008, unemployment was 10%. But in the Great Depression, unemployment rate, a quarter, a third of the workforce, people out, right, out of work. Stocks will fall dramatically between 1929 and 1932. The price of a share of U.S. Steel goes from $262 per share to $22 per share. A share of General Motors goes from $73 per share to $8 per share. I think if like Google or Amazon essentially dropped 90%, right? And so I don't know off the top of my head what they are now, but say Amazon's like $1,500 or something per share. If in 3 years it was at $150 per share, you would get a sense of how much money people would lose. And U.S. Steel and GM, these aren't deemed to be risky investments, right? These are rock solid companies that we've talked about, right, the past couple of weeks. Very high confidence in them, and that's going to be devastating. The Rockefeller family, so we talked about John D. Rockefeller family fortune, they lose about 80% of that. William C. Durant, one of the founders of GM, loses everything, essentially ends up running a bowling alley in Flint, Michigan for the rest of his life. So, working class people affected, the wealthy affected by this, everyone. U.S. Steel had 225,000 full-time workers in 1929. In 1932, they have 0 full-time workers. So, and the factories are operating at 12% of capacity, 12% of what they would be capable of producing. So this is, of course, devastating and really transforms how people live their lives, what they do in major cities. You see people lining up in the streets every day, and soup kitchens and bread lines. Detroit, Michigan, 4,000 children would stand in bread lines every day seeking food. Cities will go, communities will go through pretty quickly any funds they have set aside for poor relief. One of the things that happens is depression versus the long-standing trend where people were going from farms to cities, right? They were following work into these urban areas. the United States was becoming this more industrial nation. But now that there are no jobs, people will actually go from cities back to rural areas, and they'll just try to become subsistence farmers again and live off the land. But then you have the Dust Bowl, right, and droughts and difficult conditions. Again, sort of the perfect storm there. And obviously, that's no guaranteed path to success. Being a subsistence farmer, you still have families that are forcing to skip meals and children that are going barefoot. And with all of this going on, the suicide rate reaches its high point in American history, and the birth rate falls to its lowest. And this is not uncommon in times of economic uncertainty to see the suicide rate go up and the birth rate go down when the future is so unpredictable and volatile for people. So that image that Americans had of big business, that confidence that they had in these industries and the leaders of these companies in the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge saying the chief business of the American people is business. That's out the window with the Depression and with irregular business practices that are revealed. And, stockbrokers, right? Bankers and stockbrokers who are encouraging people to invest and actually up their portfolios and hold on to their stocks and investments while they themselves are unloading their own because they're fearful of a downturn. The same thing happened in 2008. Investors, right? Embezzling leaders of various industries embezzling funds. The Richard Whitney, the president of the New York Stock Exchange, literally was stealing funds from a program that was set aside to aid widows and orphans, poor widows and orphans. He's literally stealing money from poor women and children, the president of the New York Stock Exchange. So that is out the window, okay? And it never comes back completely. Yes, people once again gain confidence in industry and business, but never the confidence that they had of the 20s, the early 20th century. That's gone with the Great Depression. So many Americans will internalize this. They'll react to the Depression and blame themselves for their own economic misfortune, losing their job or whatever it might be. But you do start to see people that will turn outward and demand that the government step in and protest and do something. The most famous example are the World War I veterans, the bonus marchers. So those who fought in the First World War were entitled to a bonus. That wasn't supposed to be paid. That was only due until 1945, but it ends up being like $1,000. So what happens is these veterans will march on DC. They establish camps. You can see the camp, a photograph of the camp there, and there's a sign that says bonus, right? What they're there to collect. And they're saying, well, we need that now. Right? In 1932, we are struggling. So 20,000 unemployed veterans of the First World War will show up and say, hey, we need this paid now. They'll actually be driven off. Right, so they're in D.C. They'll be driven out of D.C. by federal forces under the command of Douglas MacArthur, who will be very important in World War II in the Pacific Theater, which we'll talk about next week. But they keep coming back. Right, they come back in subsequent years, and eventually they do get it paid early. Right, they get it paid during the 1930s. But an example, right, of protest, appealing to the government to bring about change. And you see that more people will become frustrated by the lack of response on the part of the federal government, in particular the President of the United States, Hoover, right? President Herbert Hoover. So Hoover was told by advisors that this is a normal part of capitalism, that you have economic downturns. This will weed out the unproductive companies, the unproductive firms, and the strong will survive, and then the country will come back better after this. So you just sort of have to ride it out. People need to tighten their belts, and that's that. Unfortunately, a lot of these people didn't realize how important consuming had become to the American economy, and that you actually need people to spend money, right? And engage in this consumer culture if you actually want sort of come out the other side and be prosperous again as a country. And Hoover is also worried about the president. He's worried about the government stepping in to provide people money. He's worried about creating dependency, that if the government gives people money, that they will become reliant upon the government. They won't want to work. They won't look for work. And this is like a slippery slope. He quoted Grover Cleveland, who was president 40 years earlier, when he said, "The government should not support the people. Federal aid weakens the sturdiness of our national character." So instead, Hoover embraced this idea of associational action. You leave it up to local businesses, local charities to raise funds and figure out ways to meet the needs of their communities, right? Leave it up to the neighbors to help their neighbors, kind of thing. And felt like this was the way forward. And he was also giving frequent addresses on the radio where he was saying things like, the tide has turned, things are getting better, we're coming out the other side of this. And you got to think, when, say you're a parent and you've just had to skip dinner, feeding your kids dinner, and you see them and they're barefoot because you can't afford a pair of shoes, and then you turn on the radio and you hear the President of the United States say how great things are, it ticks you off, right? It ticks you off, and it's not surprising that Hoover will get crushed in this presidential election of 1932. So FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had served as Undersecretary of the Navy during World War I, had run for vice president on the Democratic ticket in 1920 unsuccessfully. And then in 1921 contracts polio, where he loses the use of his legs. And this is something that's very carefully concealed from the American public. So much so that most Americans had no idea that the president that leads them through tumultuous 1930s, Great Depression, leads them through World War II. That most of the time he's actually confined to a wheelchair. So you might ask, well, how is that possible? How is he able to hide that? So I want to show you a clip from a documentary that sort of talks about this, right? How was he able to hide his diagnosis, his condition?
I don't believe 5 Americans in 100 knew he was paralyzed. I think if it had been absolutely common knowledge, it would have been very difficult to elect him. The country just simply didn't perceive Roosevelt as being handicapped. And they would look and they just could not see what they were seeing. People wanted him to be president, he wanted to be president. There was this little matter of being crippled in the way. The president was always performing. He was performing before crowds, before visitors of state, Congress, and so forth, but also for his family and everyone else. When he met Orson Welles, he said, "Orson, you and I are the 2 best actors in America." And he was right, he was right. For large crowds, they would build a ramp for the car. So the car would come into the stadium, drive up on the ramp. And then the president, still seated, would address the public. And they had the braces painted black, even though they were shiny steel. He wore black shoes, black socks, black trousers cut long, so that the braces all but disappeared if you weren't looking closely.
Most of the pictures you see of him, he's either standing up, and if you look carefully, he's holding on to somebody's arm, or he's sitting in a chair. Very few pictures of him in a wheelchair. So this was not exactly a conspiracy, but it was a conspiracy of consent between photographers and the White House. something that could never exist today.
So, right, hiding that, concealing that from the American people, and successful, right? Obviously successful in doing that. So when he accepts the Democratic nomination in 1932, this is where FDR promises a new deal for the American people, saying, I'm going to do something different. Doesn't go into a ton of detail about what that actually is, but saying, I'm not going to do nothing like the current president is, right? Like Herbert Hoover is doing. And when just traditionally, almost always, when the United States is experiencing an economic downturn and there's an election, they almost always vote for the opposition, right? They do not vote for the incumbent. They want a change of some kind. Let's give someone else a shot. And wins decisively in this election. Democrats, he is a Democrat. Democrats win a sweeping majority in Congress. In his inaugural address, this is where FDR famously says the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So trying to alleviate that sense of panic, counteracting that idea that, you know, the panic selling and the runs on banks, and trying to avoid more of that. So I want to play that part of the speech for you, and then what he says he might do, how he's going to act as president, how he's going to be different.
Expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. We face our common difficulties. They concern, thank God, as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek within my constitutional authority to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
So context for this speech matters, right? If you just think about like a president today saying they're going to use broad executive power to wage a war on an economic situation, there would be a lot of people who would be up in arms. But in 1933, I should say, he celebrated, right? The people are applauding, right? Waving their hats, waving the flags. Yes, please use broad executive power to bring about a change. So Roosevelt looks at this New Deal as sort of an alternative to political extremes. And what I mean by that is it's somewhere in between socialism on the left, right? Government control of the economy on the left, and then unregulated capitalism on the right. It feels like there is a middle ground that can be struck. We can do something. We don't have to do nothing. Right? We don't have to do all of it, but we need to take some sort of action. So when he gets into office, he will move pretty aggressively. And again, he has the benefit of a Congress that is his party, right? That allows him to move forward with really unprecedented amount of legislation in the first 3 months. So we call this the 100 days, his first 3 months in office, and how this will very dramatically change the role of the government in this economic situation. And trying to bring the country out of this, right? Trying to use the power of the federal government to bring about change. Centerpiece of what we call, so this is also what we refer to as the first, right? First New Deal. The National Industrial Recovery Act, very important to this, which establishes the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, which will seek to set standards for output, for prices, for working conditions. Will seek to bring together leaders of these various industries to agree on this. And really, you can see it's trying to eliminate that idea of cutthroat competition, right? Driving out competing businesses. Not a good time for the United States in terms of that, right? You want people in various businesses thriving in industries, multiple businesses thriving in industries. So trying to end that cutthroat competition, unregulated capitalism that we talked about of the Gilded Age. And then a host of other agencies, organizations, and you see the acronyms for these, and they become sort of a part of the political vocabulary of the day. So the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the FERA, provides funds to local agencies to then distribute to figure out, who's in need, how to use it. But FDR much prefers something else. He doesn't like the idea of the federal government giving money directly to people. He's also worried about reliance on the government. He's worried about dependency and this slippery slope. So instead, his preference is you give people temporary government jobs, set them to work. And so it's sort of like two birds with one stone. You help solve unemployment, right, by people now engaging in work. And then you can have them work on things that are of benefit to the country, right? Things that need worked on. So one of the biggest is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which employed men who would work on flood control, wildlife preservation, work on national parks, access to national parks, improving these public lands. Very big organization dealing with that. The Public Works Administration, just like it sounds, public infrastructure, buildings, roads, dams, like the Hoover Dam, a lot of it built by PWA workers. Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, sought to bring electricity to Tennessee Valley rural areas in Appalachia, for instance. So places that we talked about in the South that didn't experience like the market revolution even, let alone sort of the modern changes of the early 20th century, trying to bring them into this more modern, right, more technologically advanced society. This is just a few examples. Right? There are certainly others, but you get an idea, right, of what his approach is here. So in 1935, I'm really moving my screen all around in this lecture. 1935, FDR will write a letter to 100,000 American clergymen asking them, hey, like, what do you see in your churches, your congregations, your communities? Does it look like things are getting better? Now he's a couple years into his economic policies and proposals. And the responses that he gets makes it clear, well, he hasn't solved it. People still are struggling. Right? Their unemployment is still an issue. Financially, people are finding it difficult to get by. So this motivates him to launch what's called the Second New Deal. And this one has an emphasis on economic security. So the first New Deal, its focus is on recovery, right? Recovery for the nation, getting out of depression. And then the Second New Deal emphasis is on economic security. And centerpiece for this, not surprising, Social Security Act of 1935. So this establishes a system where there's aid to, there's unemployment insurance, there's old age pensions, there's aid to the disabled, there's aid to the elderly poor, people with dependent children. If you've ever heard the phrase like welfare state, this is the beginning of that idea in the United States, that the federal government will create somewhat of a social safety net for its most vulnerable, or most vulnerable, at least some of the most vulnerable people in the country. So this will forever change the debate and dynamic about the role of government in the economy from the United States. So prior to 1935, the debate in the country was whether or not the government should intervene in the economy at all. Like, what is the role of government in the economy? People are saying, well, either it has some role or it shouldn't intervene at all. Right? That was the debate. With the Social Security Act of 1935, well, the debate is no longer whether or not the government is going to intervene, because clearly it is. Now the question is, to what extent should the government play a role in economic conversations, right? And how the economy runs, in businesses, all of that, in the lives of individuals. This is clearly something we still debate. Right? This is one of the most divisive topics in our political discourse today, is what is the proper role of government in the economy. So some people saying the government should do more. Right? The federal government should intervene more, state government should intervene more, and other people saying should be more limited. However you feel about that, that's your call. As you guys know, I say that a lot in this class in terms of your opinions and not wanting to influence you with mine. But that conversation that we're having now, it very much shifts, and we start to see it in this moment, right? This moment in 1935. So something to keep in mind, and maybe we can talk more about that in our discussion. What I wanted to leave you with is this image. This image. So I'll get my image off because it's very distracting when you're looking at a picture. But many people would argue that this is like the iconic image of the Great Depression, this era, the 1930s, that this single image represents so much. If you look at like any history textbook and you go to the chapter on the Great Depression, it's like this picture is in there all the time. So what I want to talk about this in class, I want you to think about as you look at this. It's called Migrant Mother. If you want to look it up, look at some background of it, you can. But why do you think this is such an iconic image? I would argue maybe this is the most important primary source of the Great Depression era, because it still generates so much conversation of the topic. So, whoops. Just to wrap this up, a lot of connections to things that we've gone through recently. As I said, economic recession of 2008, conversations that we're still having politically, conversations that we're still having about government and business and all of that. So as you read through your documents and sources, something to think about. I actually think